That's why today I'm so excited to share a really famous and really amazing story from the Bible. It's about three young men, we think, probably late teenage years, who were faced with a similar moment where they couldn't make God happy and they couldn't make the people in front of them happy at the same time. They had to pick one of the two. The stakes were high, everything was on the line, and yet we're going to meet three young men who were so passionate about God that they didn't just kind of sort of believe in him. No, they were willing to serve him, in fact, even suffer for him, in fact, even sacrifice everything for him. Today, we're going to study their courageous moment of faith, and we're going to ask ourselves the question, why did they do it? What did they think when they thought about God that they said, no matter what the world says or does or threatens, there is zero chance that we will not serve, love, and trust in God with our whole heart? Let's try to answer that question today as we dive into this famous story, the three men in the fiery furnace. It's found in Daniel chapter 3, and here's how the chapter begins. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. A cubit was an ancient unit of measurement from the elbow to the tip of the fingers, about 18 inches. So a 90-foot tall by 9-foot wide image, and he set it up on the plain, nice flat place where everyone could see it, the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So anyone who's anyone in Babylon is coming. Verse 3, so, because you want to make Nebuchadnezzar happy, so the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, doesn't matter your culture, your ethnicity, your religion, what your parents believe, all of you, this is what you are commanded, not suggested, to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, because he wanted to make Nebuchadnezzar happy, as soon as they heard the sound of the Babylonian band, you can read it for yourself, all the nations, not a few, all of them, and peoples of every language, not some of them, every language, fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, a bit of backstory. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar, the ancient, most powerful man on earth, was a bit of a narcissist. In Daniel chapter 2, right before this text, King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream where he sees a giant statue. The head is made of gold, the chest is made of silver, other parts are made of bronze and clay. And he wakes up, he doesn't know what it means. And so Daniel interprets the dream for him. And he says, well, Nebuchadnezzar, that giant statue represents all different kinds of political kingdoms. The head of gold, that's your kingdom of Babylon. After you, there'll come another kingdom, that's the silver. And after that, another kingdom, that's the bronze and so forth. Well, Nebuchadnezzar wakes up and he decides to try to make his dream come true, except this time with a twist. He builds a 90-foot tall image, maybe of himself, maybe of one of his favorite gods. And what does he make it of? All of gold, which in his dream represented himself. This egomaniac says to everyone, I am the king of all kings. The Babylonian kingdom, my kingdom, is an eternal kingdom that will never be followed by any other kingdom. And to recognize my sovereignty, my greatness, and my glory, I'll make the statue, and you get two choices. When you hear the band, you bow or you burn. They say that clarity is kindness, but in this case it was cruelty. And Nebuchadnezzar's wishes to make him happy were a problem for three men that you may have heard of, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their greatest passion was not just to serve the king of Babylon, it was to serve the real king of all kings, whose kingdom is paved with gold. It was to put their God first. And when Nebuchadnezzar heard it, I try to picture this. The band plays. How many people were there? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. They all hit their face to the ground out of fear of Nebuchadnezzar, but three men stay standing. And when someone first looked to the side as they were bowing and they saw, and the whispers started to run through the crowd, the word got back to Nebuchadnezzar that there were 3 people there who were not trying to make him happy. And he was not happy. Let's jump to verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I've made, very good. I'm feeling in a good mood today, boys. I'm going to give you a second chance. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Now, let's imagine for a second that none of us know how this story ends. Can you imagine being in the headspace of these 3 teenage boys? How terrible and how terribly tempting that moment must have been. I mean, how terrible. I made the mistake of Googling of what happens to the human body when it gets too close to heat it was not made to endure. This was not just like a gun to the head and boom, before you know it, your faithfulness ends you in heaven. This is a torturous and miserable way to die. It must have been so terrible to think about. And it must have been so tempting to compromise. Like, can you imagine? Oh, okay, God, I'm sorry. I'll ask for your forgiveness. You're merciful. All I got to do is bow down for 1 second. I just got to compromise for 1 moment, and then it'll all be over, and then I'll get back to serving God. Or maybe I'll bow down to the image outwardly, but inwardly, I'm going to pray to the real God. I'll still kind of put him first in my life, even if people don't have that impression. It would have been so tempting in the face of certain death to move God to some other place on their tower of priorities. And yet for these 3 Jewish teenagers, that was not an option. They were not willing for a second or a moment to compromise their commitment to the one true God. And they stood up boldly, courageously, and respectfully to the most powerful man on the planet. Here's what they said. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." This response is more golden than the giant statue that Nebuchadnezzar built. Did you notice how incredibly respectful these young teenage boys were to the man who was threatening to kill them? Meshach didn't drop the mic, and Shadrach didn't snap back with some snarky comment. Right? Abednego didn't put up a little sign like, "Let's go Babylonian Brandon," in his yard. No, do you notice what they said? They said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, your majesty." They said, "Not you pagan, I'm going to serve my God." No, they address him with such respect, even though he's the worst possible option holding political office. Do you think we need to learn that lesson today? Listen, if you're a Christian, the Bible says it doesn't matter how bad it gets. It could be Pontius Pilate, Caesar Augustus, or King Nebuchadnezzar. We might have to speak the truth to powerful people, but never, ever, 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 ever without gentleness and respect for the office and the authority. And yet they speak with such respect, but they speak with such courage. They say, "The God that we serve, O King, he's able to save us. In fact, we believe he will, but we will not. We cannot. You could kill us if that's what you want. We think God will save us, but even if he doesn't, we will not serve you. You are not our greatest love. You are not the ultimately golden statue. There's a God, and it's not you. There's one we serve, and at the end of the day, it's not you. So with all due respect, your majesty, we can't and we won't." Here was his response. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Summary, the king was furious. The boys were flammable, trousers, turbans, and everything else. And the fiery furnace was fierier than that furnace had ever been. And then God showed up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement. And he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. These 3 boys stroll out like they just starred in a Febreze commercial. Right? They're Tide Pod fresh, and everyone gathers around, and they say, what happened? What happened? There was someone else in the fire that day. I was trying to picture what Nebuchadnezzar must have seen. Remember, the furnace was heated hotter than it had ever been, so bright you could barely look at it. But apparently there was someone so much brighter than the brightest flame that all you could say, it looks like a son of the gods. Was this an angel that God sent to protect these courageous Jewish teenagers, maybe? Was this Jesus showing up on earth long before his birth in Bethlehem? That could be. We don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that the God that they believed could save them decided to save them. And it was such a shocking moment that Nebuchadnezzar, who before was punishing these boys for their faith in God, he said this in chapter 3, verse 29, no other God can save this way.